Welcome back. So in the last video, we left off by creating this blank white canvas in Affinity Designer, and we're going to start this video by giving you a brief tour of the interface. So right now you can see this white space is where we can create our design. We can zoom in and out of it. And on the left side are all of the tools at our disposal. Now we'll go through each and every one of these at some point and in some form, but for now let's just focus on a few important ones. So let's start with the shapes. Each of these are just potential shapes that we can create, and here are a bunch of more specific ones. And so let's just create a circle. So we click on the circle, and now you can see our cursor has changed, and that means that we can start creating shapes. So if we just click and drag, then we can set the dimensions and location of our circle. And now a little tip is that you can hold down the Shift key while you're doing this to create equal width and height dimensions. Now you'll notice that when we let go, the shape is created, and yet our cursor stays as these crosshairs. What that means is that we can continue creating circles or whatever shape we have selected, and we could just go on forever. But if we want to go back to not creating circles, then we need to change to a different tool. So in this case, we'll go back to our original move tool here at the top. And now you can see our cursor is back to normal, and we can click and select the different shapes to edit their properties, delete them, move them around, and click and drag to select multiple of them. Now you may have noticed that as we create each shape, a new row appears here on the right side of our screen. Now this is called the Layers panel. Now we can switch between these different panels, and we can actually click and drag this panel to give it a little bit more room. And if you really wanted to, you can even move these around. Now for each of these rows, they represent one of the shapes on our canvas. So let's play around a bit. So for this shape, let's set it a different color, and perhaps we want this shape in the background. Well, these rows here correspond to the order that they appear on the screen. So if we want this green one behind the others, we can just click and drag it in the back. And we also have a few other tools. We can change its opacity here, make it a little bit more transparent, somewhere in between. And we can also hide this layer entirely. We can also click Command L or right click and lock it so that no matter what we do, we won't move it around. So for example, you might want to create a background, and then you might want to lock it in place so that you don't accidentally move around the background. So we can just move that to the back and Command L, and now it's locked. We can also rename shapes, which is useful when you're dealing with a very complex design. So we can double click here on the ellipse in this case and just type in, green shape or whatever you'd like. And whatever shape is selected here, or multiple of them, or from the Layers panel, we can now change its color over here on the top right section of the screen. Now you'll notice that there's actually two different options here. There's a donut, which represents the outline around the shape, and then there's the full circle, which represents the fill color. So if we want the fill to be blue, then we'll make sure we're selected on the full circle, and then we can choose a different blue that we like. And then we can click on the outline and change it to whatever color we want. Now you notice that the outline is quite small, so we can change that up here, stroke, and then we can click on this button to change its size. Now let me just say I'm aware that this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to memorize every button and feature all at once. The idea here is just to give you a general sense of where everything is located on the interface, because I think if you have a panel with 100 different buttons, it's kind of overwhelming not to know in any way what they do, even if you only end up using, for the most part, 10 or 20 of them. So let's continue with our tour of the interface. Now, a lot of these different buttons here at the top are only available when we select one of our objects. So let's do that, and let's explore what these do. So all of these are about aligning our different objects. So we can select all of them and say we want them all to be aligned here at the top. Well, we can see this blue line represents the alignment. So if we click that, all of them will jump to the top. See? So all of them are lined up according to their fill right here. And you can play around with these. So for example, these space the different objects out. So we can put them like this. And if we want them to be spaced out, we can select all of them. I'll shift click this last one since I can't reach it. And then we can distribute them equally vertically. And here are our different options, which basically do what we did earlier of moving the different layers around. So if we want to move one to the back or the front, we can click on it here or in the layers panel and then move it to the front or move it to the back or just move it forward one space or back one space. So notice what happens in the layer panel as I click on these buttons. Over here we have the different flip options, so we can flip it, which you don't notice because it is symmetrical, or we can flip it the other way, which you just notice by the handle. But for example, if we rotate it, then you'll notice the difference. And then we can rotate it by 90 degrees in any different option. And these options here have to do with snapping. So that's a little bit more advanced and we won't play around with these buttons quite yet. But to give you a general sense, as we move these shapes around, you'll notice that they have these red and green lines. Those are helping us align our different objects together, but we won't get into that yet. Now finally, here in the corner are 5 different options that have to do with compound shapes. And I would argue these are some of the most useful features in the entire application if you know how to use them. So let's talk about those in depth. So I've brought in these 3 icons here to help illustrate why these 5 features in the top right corner are so fundamentally important. Now we're going to design each of these 3 ourselves, and we're going to start with the house. And you might be wondering, well, how do we create a house shape when none of these shapes over here on the left tools panel look like a house? And that's the magic of those features. So if we break each of these down, they're just combinations of these other basic shapes. So for the house, we just look at this and we'll notice that, well, this is a triangle at the top, and this is a rectangle, and it's got another rectangle cut out of it. Well, that's pretty simple, right? So we can just choose the triangle, click and drag roughly here, and we've got some weirdness going on. What's happening is our stroke was turned on, so we'll turn that to no line style, and then we can adjust this. So I'll click the move tool and move this down just a bit. If you have any trouble with the snapping, then you can just use the arrow keys to move by just a little bit. We're good there. And so now we can move to our rectangle tool and click and drag that to create it. And let's set the opacity down a little bit so that we can see through it to create our other rectangle. And I'm going to click Command D to deselect this shape so that we can create a new one. And now I'm going to just create this other shape. So if you were really in a pinch, then you could just set this shape to a white color and basically achieve the same effect that we're about to accomplish. But that doesn't really illustrate the usefulness of these tools, so bear with me. What we want to do is create a new shape based on these 3 shapes we have here. So for example, let's imagine that our background is actually a gradient and we want it to show through this door here. Well, we can't show the same gradient on the door, so we need it to be transparent, but just in this box. So now you see the dilemma. So actually we need to subtract this rectangle from this one. And the way that we do that is by clicking on the move tool and then selecting this one and this one. So we'll hold down our shift key. So now we've got both of them selected. You can see here on the layers panel. And then we go up here to the top right and it's this subtract button. Now, the one that is subtracted from is the bottom layer. So because our white rectangle is on top, it will subtract from the blue rectangle below it. So that's correct. And now we'll click subtract. Now you actually don't notice any difference visually because our background is white, but say we put something in the background, you can see that it actually shows through this rectangle here. So we have made a difference. And lastly, we want to combine this shape with this shape, so we'll do the same thing. Select this one, hold down shift, and then select the second shape. Both are selected here in the layers panel, and now we can click add. So now we have a new compound shape that looks exactly like we want it to. So we did it. We've recreated the first shape. So the reason I chose this second Instagram icon is that there's actually a bunch of different ways you could recreate this and achieve the same result. So we'll just choose one different way for variety than the way we did it the first time, and that is by creating outlines for all of these different shapes, with the exception of this circle. So we can zoom in a bit, and the first easy part is that obviously this is just a little circle, so that won't take much work. But for this one, we're going to be creating an outline. In other words, a shape that has no fill, but only has an outline. Let's Command C to copy this shape and Command V. So you can see a new shape appeared in the layers panel, and this is just to get you practice. You could just as easily have created a new circle here on the left side. And then we'll click to the Move tool, and we will position this one where we want it. And I'm clicking and dragging this, and I'm actually holding down the Shift and the Command keys to make sure that it's centered and stays proportional. So I'll move it into that white space, and then we're actually going to go up here and make it no fill. So click on the fill, and then this little button sets it to be no fill. So now actually it's a shape, but it has no fill and it has no outline, so it's invisible. So I'll Command Z that move, and then for the outline, we'll click on the donut, and we'll change it to whatever color we want, something different. And then we can change the stroke size, remember, here at the top. And actually, it's doing something funky, so we can play around with where that outline is started. In this case, we want it to start on the outside. Notice that difference. So we can play around until we get the result we want. Great. So we've got our first two shapes. And the last one is actually a rectangle. So we will click the rectangle tool, and we'll start here, holding the Shift key, remember, because we want it to keep the square dimensions. And we will move it a little bit to position that. Great. And the corner function up here allows us to kind of change the curvature. And let's just set this to that same red that we just used. So I'm clicking into the swatches, changing it to be the fill, and then this has all of our recent colors. So we've already recently used that color, so for consistency, we'll click on that. And now we've achieved our second shape. Hooray! Now this last icon gets a little bit tricky, and that's because you can't just add and subtract the existing shapes to reach this result, at least not in an easy way. So the purpose of this is to show you how to create custom shapes. And we're not going to create this entire shape just for the interest of time, but we're going to start on this base so you can see how custom shapes are designed. So in this case, we just need a starting shape. So we can really choose any of these, but I'm going to choose the ellipse tool. And the reason for that is sometimes you can notice that although the shape is pretty different from any of these, for example, there's no triangle, and none of them look like a rectangle or a rounded rectangle or even a circle too much, there are some individual shapes that you can tell within the larger one. So here, there's obviously a circle going on. So let's start with that. All we need to do is just start with some kind of shape. So I'll create the circle there, put it in place, and this is where the custom shape begins. Now what we're going to do is start editing the points of this circle to change its shape into something unique. And to do that, we need to tell Affinity Designer that we want it to show us the points that create this shape so that we can start editing them. So all we have to do is click the shape and then go up to Convert to Curves. And now we can click on the Node tool. And the Node tool effectively shows us the different points that create the shape. So the shape itself did not change yet, but we can start to change it now that we have these shapes. So actually I'm going to rotate this a bit so that the bottom point is directed in the way that we want it. Then go back to the Node tool. And then you can see that I can actually click and drag, and just like a shape, I could click and drag to select multiple nodes, in fact. And just a bit of terminology, these points are called nodes. So if you see that in the interface, that's what that means. And so I can click and drag on this node, for example, move it where I want it to be. And then these two handles on the side allow me to change the curve. So you can see that I'm matching the curve. And you can click and drag anywhere on this line to create a new node. And in fact, you can option click one of the handles to remove it entirely so that there is no curve. It's just a direct line. And you can just keep on adding more nodes, adjusting their curves, deleting them, and so on until you achieve that end result. And that's how you create a custom shape using nodes. Now, I know this video is getting a bit long, but before we end this particular lesson, the last thing I want to go over is text, because that's something you're certainly going to need to create thumbnails. And this, luckily, is pretty simple. There are two text options here on the A button, and the one that you'll probably be working with is the basic one, which is called the artistic text tool. And it works just like any other shape. You select that tool, and then you just click and drag to create it. And then at the top, we can change its properties. So if we click the move tool to select all of the text, then we can move it around, rotate it like any other shape, and we can change the font and, of course, all of these different options. A cool thing you can do is select your text and then convert it to curves. Now, we ran out of room for the convert to curve button here, but the easy way to do it is holding down Command Return, and that turns it into a group of shapes. We can ungroup it with Command Shift G. Now we have each letter as an individual curve, and we could edit these just like any other shape by going into the node tool and clicking and dragging around. And this is useful for stylizing text or doing anything custom that you want with it. Now, once you change it to a curve, you can't change it back to text, so make sure you type in whatever you want before you convert it to curves. Let me just say again that this stuff takes practice, so before you begin the next video, in which we'll go over some more advanced techniques, take a while, maybe an hour or two even, to just monkey around and have something in mind that you want to create. A good place to start is a simple icon shape, and then try to recreate it, and just play around with the interface, because that first-hand practice is necessary to achieve that mastery level, which results in good thumbnails. So get some practice, and I'll see you in the next video.